Caswell will be presented by Barry Rayburn, our very own Leroy Community Theater, creator of many plays and produces them, and he's got a lot of talent, but he's going to be presenting one of our early settlers.
Hello, my name is Daniel Caswell, and today I'd like to share with you some of the memories I have of first moving here and what I remember particularly about living here. Now, I wasn't the first settler, but I arrived in 1855. I was born in 1821, and when I was 33 years old, I moved here from Leroy, New York. Now, Leroy, New York, it's a small town. It's just east of Buffalo. I like to think it was my suggestion to name this village Leroy. I had heard some very promising things about the fertile farmland here and the extensive woodlands. Now, I arrived with my wife Sarah and my adorable little daughter Clara. Now, the next year we had a son named Otis, and then we had Helen. She was born in 1858, and then there was Daniel. He was born in 1863, and then there was William, born in 1864. Now, I looked it over here, and it occurred to me the best location for a new village would be right at the fork of those two rivers, the Little Iowa and the Upper Iowa River. Now, there was already a sawmill on the east side of the river, and that was owned by Henry Edmonds. Well, I partnered up with Martin Shook and A.J. Palmer, and together we bought that sawmill. Now, it wasn't too long when Martin Shook, he sold his share to Lewis Matthews. And then in 1857, the three of us, we decided we were going to have this settlement surveyed and platted on both sides of the river. Well, about a year later, I sold my part of the mill to Palmer and Matthews, and in return, they sold me their shares of interest in the land on the west side of the river. Now, they converted that sawmill into a flour mill. Now, that was a huge benefit to the local farmers, as they didn't have to haul their wheat such a long distance anymore to get it processed. Now, once we got the streets platted out, things started to happen. The mill was on the east side of the river, but the village itself was on the west side of the river, and then running east and west, that's where the main street was, right across the dam there. In 1857, I built a hotel and a store in the village. I built my house just east of the flour mill. I say my first house is where I built that, and it burnt the next year. That was a problem there, so I had to rebuild. But we built a little bigger. And because we had a little extra room, that's where we put the schoolhouse for a while. And then it was sometime later we built a proper schoolhouse on the southwest edge of town there. Well, my hotel, it always seemed busy. There was a lot of grain haulers coming and going with their wheat. And in addition to the people, there's also a lot of animals. Pulling all those carts and whatnot, you had a lot of horses and oxen, so we had to build a lot of stables too. Well then, unknown to me or the federal government, it seemed my hotel became the post office. And I was sort of a postmaster for a while. And my hotel even hosted some weddings. In 1867, we had a monumental event take place. You might say that was the monkey wrench that was thrown into the wheels. The Milwaukee Railroad arrived. And the train depot, well, that was laid out about 1 mile southeast of our little village. Well, if a fellow wanted to stay in business, you had to follow the railroad. So, in 1868, I sold my hotel and the property and the buildings and whatnot, sold it all to Mower County. They built a poor farm there, I guess. And then shortly after that, we also created a dedicated cemetery where it sits today. Well, then I came into the village here and I built a brand new hotel with a basement. I called it the Caswell House. Cost me $12,000. Well, it was considered one of the best hotels in southern Minnesota for quite a while. I built it at the intersection of Main and Broadway. Several years later, I traded that hotel for a farm that was owned by Caleb Lewis. Well, by 1870, Leroy was exploding. The population had climbed to 1,005, give or take a horse. Farming was definitely the biggest industry, but we also had a lot of other businesses going on here. I made a short list for you. There were blacksmiths, dry goods stores, butchers, carpenters, clergymen, brewers, a jewelry store, fire insurance agents, furniture dealer, grocery store, a grist mill, harness maker, hardware store, livery stables, a photographer, a lawyer, machinery dealers, stonemasons, teamsters, post office, doctors, a school, and a telegraph operator. Now, some people kind of referred to me as a wheeler dealer and maybe even a risk taker. Well, I never regretted moving here, but my luck did run out eventually. I met my demise July 10, 1870, when I was accidentally shot. I died at the age of 48. So I thank you for your time. You have a good day.
Our next presenter is Maggie Ryan. No, Maggie Ryan is the former citizen. Ryan Longley is her presenter, and Ryan is a teacher from Minneapolis. And her story was written by Pamela Greenwood, and so many of Maggie's relatives are here today from the cities, and we welcome all of you visiting today.
All right. Hello, just testing the microphone here. All right. Being here with you reminds me of a time more than 100 years ago when my sisters came back with their families from Minneapolis to visit my grave. My 8-year-old niece, Letitia Mary, was shaking her head as the grown-ups shook out coverlets and opened picnic baskets. She whispered to herself, "A picnic? In a cemetery? What the heck?" My family had moved away. Ma's sisters and her pa had come over from Ireland when I was about 6 years old. They all settled in Minneapolis. Her pa, my grandpa, was now getting older, and I knew Ma was wanting to be near them, to take care of Grandpa. And listen to me go on. Ma would be telling me to mind my manners and tell you who I am. Margaret Ryan, that's who. Everybody called me Maggie. I grew up right in the middle of the Ryan family, the 5th of 9 kids, born on October 7th, 1876. I lived here all my 18 years. Pa, Patrick Ryan, had come to Leroy along with the railroad. After the Civil War, he worked laying the track across the northern corner of Iowa through Kalmar, Cresco, and Chester. When he got to Leroy, he fell in love with the land and with Ma. Yes, Pa was here with the old village, got its start, and he was waiting at the station with the whole community for that first passenger train to come whistling in, connecting the East Coast to us. September 9th, 1867. I don't know if Mom had gotten off that first train. How romantic would that be? But for certain, they got married a year later by Father John McDermott. Ma, Hannah Kennedy, was just a young girl when Patrick left their townland in Ireland. When she was 20 and full of adventure, she came to America and on to Leroy. And the rest is history. Well, the history of our Ryan family. They settled down and started a family right here. Pa bought some land in town. In fact, we lived in a block where the History Museum is today. Their door was always open. Ma always had a pot of stew or a loaf of bread for neighbors in need. Sadly, their firstborn son died when he was only 2 months old. Ma had been helping a neighbor who had the flu, and he caught it. Another son died just a week after he was born. Life was hard, but Ma was a strong and cheerful woman. Ma and Pa had Mass at their house before the wood-frame St. Patrick's Church was built in 1878 at the end of their block. Faith was important, and education was too, to everyone who settled here. Ma's grandfather had been an educator in Ireland, and she would not have approved of the letter I was writing on the morning of October 1st, 1894. Oh, she would have approved of the letter, just not that I was writing it in algebra class. But I wanted to tell my sister Aggie, who was up in Minneapolis, more about the cyclone that ripped through the town on September 21st. It had been raining hard that day, and Ma thought I should just stay home from the dance at the Opera House. As it turned out, none of us girls had gone. It was around 10:30 we heard the crashing and crunching sounds. Scores of homes and businesses were destroyed, their contents strewn over miles and miles. You know that terrible feeling, what with the devastating storm in Teope last month? Then and now, people came together to help each other. Sadly for Leroy, in 1894, 3 people had died, and many more had been injured. The Caswell house burned down, lightning strikes and kerosene lamps and the wind were to blame. The grain elevator was gone. 4 of men who came to build a new elevator were boarding with us, Mr. Carr and his son Will Burns, and another fellow from Adams. Charlie Smart barn was blown away, and he loaned his horse and buggy to our older sister Sadie. She taught school not far from Leroy and could use it to get there instead of walking the whole way. She had mailed her letter to Aggie that morning. I was writing mine during algebra class. I hadn't had time before school because of helping Ma with food preparation for our boarders. Ma likes things just right. I wrote to Aggie, but don't tell her I said this or I'd catch it, you bet. I described the excursion on Sunday. You couldn't get through the streets packed with about 3,000 people, all come to see what had happened. We were trying to get back to normal, but as I wrote that letter, I didn't think it would be a normal birthday I'd be having on October 7th. Or that I'd have a new dress for it like Aggie had for hers. I told her her dress was pretty, and that if I was her, I'd get some nice clothes while she had a chance, and not do without them either. School stayed open until about a week after I died. What with people crowded together working nonstop to rebuild the town, diseases could spread. I got diphtheria, that dreaded disease that had been around for centuries, but it wasn't until a few years after I died that vaccines were developed. Ma's heart was heavy, but she didn't have time to sit down and mourn. She doubled down her efforts to keep our house spotless with one less pair of hands to help her. Thankfully, no one else in our family got it. The school closed for a few weeks more to prevent further spread. My family moved to Minneapolis soon after. I wasn't sure how I felt about moving away when Ma and Pa had first discussed it. It was exciting to hear about Aggie's life there, but I couldn't imagine leaving my friends I'd known my whole life. But my whole class graduated without me. Pa's mother Mary had lived with us when I was little, so there were 4 of us here when they moved, in this cemetery right under what is now a huge tree by the entrance. They made cemetery visits, then my sisters brought their children, and those children brought theirs, and so it continues. Thank you for being here today and sharing my memories. Thank you.
Our next former citizen is Marguerite Ben, and she will be presented by Janet Mayer, her niece. Janet and her siblings compiled Marguerite's amazing story, and she makes it very personable. So it's very special when you know the former citizen. Janet?
Welcome. I'm so glad to be with you here today. You know, I never miss a Memorial Day service at the Leroy Cemetery. I hope you were all out there earlier today to see the goings-on. Even though I've not lived in Leroy since my high school days, I always come to the Memorial Day services. I put flowers on the graves of my loved ones. Even my great-grandparents are buried out there. And I spend time with my sisters and brother and their families. We usually have a picnic dinner after the cemetery services. One year I was even put on childcare duty when my niece Donna was born. I helped care for the older girls in the family. They were so excited to have a new baby sister. Maybe I better introduce myself. Maybe you saw my picture back there. I'm Marguerite Bend. I was born in November of 1911, the second child of Adolph and Fanny Mahoney Bend. We lived on a farm 2 to 3 miles west of Leroy, known as the Frank Farm. I have an older sister, Marcella, and when I was 2 years old, my brother Frederick was born, and then later a sister, Irene, and another sister, Eleanor, completed our family. My sister Irene died in February of 1919 during the Spanish flu epidemic. She was only 4 years old. As I was about 8 years old at the time, I tried to help my mother care for her as much as I could. I think that's when I decided I wanted to be a nurse. We knew how very sick she was. Fortunately, others in the family didn't get sick. Many people died as there was no good treatment for the Spanish flu. And who would have thought 100 years later we'd have a similar type of epidemic? In 1920, when I was 9 years old, our family moved to a farm closer to Leroy. My nephew Roger Bend and his family still live on that farm. I attended Leroy High School. Even though we were not far from Leroy, it was sometimes difficult to get to town for school. We didn't have a school bus then. Occasionally, the neighbor's horse and sleigh in the wintertime would take us to town. So especially during my high school years, I frequently stayed with my grandmother Mahoney, who lived in Leroy. In fact, she lived just in the house west of here, where Barb and Gerald Payne live today. Following my high school graduation in 1929, I enrolled in the Kaler School of Nursing in Rochester. I studied hard to become an RN and to be able to care for others. I was so proud when I got my nurse's cap and my pin back in 1933. Later, I was able to go to the University of Minnesota and earn my bachelor's degree in nursing. I worked as a nurse in Rochester and Battle Creek, Michigan, and when the United States entered World War II, I felt a need to serve my country, and I enlisted in the Army. Do you know, I was the first woman from Leroy to enlist in the military. I hope others will see the value of serving our country and follow my lead. I was commissioned on April 10th, 1942, and went to Fort Custer, Michigan for training. After more training in Mississippi, and later that summer, we were deployed to North Africa. I was on a ship named appropriately the Florence Nightingale. We set sail on December 12th, 1942, and on December 26th, yes, the day after Christmas, we landed in Oran, Algeria, ready to do our part in fighting this world war. The trip over had been a rough one, so we were glad to have our feet on solid ground. As we disembarked the ship by rope ladders or gangplanks, we had no idea what was awaiting us. With the memories of the kindness and the consideration shown by the Navy on our voyage, the war still seemed very remote, but we were about to learn the realities of war. The Army loaded us onto trucks to take us to our destination. The first hospital was at Ain el Turk, a small village. The day we arrived, the sun was shining, there were lovely French villas and flowers around them, and the beautiful blue Mediterranean Sea. What could be more wonderful? Well, after that sunny day, we had weeks of rain and cold, their rainy season. What a change. The area where our hospital was spread out on long roads and included many buildings. Our unit was a part of the 12th General Hospital. We were in that area almost a year. During that time, we were not only nurses, but we were housekeepers, confidants, and friends. Cleanliness was of the utmost importance. It is so different from what we learned in nursing school, where soap and antiseptics were so readily available. We did the best to clean up our soldiers when they came off the battlefields. We did everything we could to avoid any deadly infections. We learned not to waste anything, soap and water included. You probably think I should be in a white nurse's uniform today. Well, our white uniforms were worn when we were on duty here in the States. But when we reached the battlefront, things were a little bit different. White uniforms were not often very practical. Sometimes it was impossible to keep them clean. We were issued khaki uniforms, a shirt and a skirt, which we wore most of the time, but sometimes we also wore khaki pants instead of the skirt. For outside wear, we were issued a dark blue jacket and skirt, white or blue shirt, black tie, black shoes. We sometimes had a blue cape when we went out, like a coat. I wore this US pin on each collar, and I was so proud of the pin. And then I also wore a pin with a letter N on it, signifying the Nurses Corps. We were proud to be part of the Army Corps. I also had, this was part of my traditional military dress uniform, and wore this hat with it. All of our belongings were kept in a green military trunk that traveled with us wherever we were stationed. As a nurse, I was a friend to the patients. When the boys came to our hospital injured, they didn't know anyone, and they were in rough shape. Aside from his actual physical care, I made sure the soldiers' supplies were in order. I read him letters from home, that is, whenever the mail came through, which wasn't very often. I wrote letters back home for him, to his parents, his wife, or his sweetheart. No email or cell phones back then. Many of our injured soldiers were not only physically hurting, but so homesick. Don't we all want family with us when we don't feel well or when we're hurting? Those boys were just the same. They were suffering in so many ways. Our job was to care for them and get them ready for the next step, whether it be evacuation to another hospital or back to the battlegrounds. Many times we had to improvise equipment. We also worked with a shortage of medical supplies when the ships and trucks were delayed. It was such an experience I never could have imagined. But we were doing our part to protect our freedoms that are so important to all of us. As nurses, we ate together in a mess hall. There's a picture back there of me in the mess hall. It was more like a big tent. Our food was adequate, but I think we all miss Mom's home cooking. The first morning we had real coffee was just like heaven. Even the Spam tasted delicious. Well, at least at first. We also lived in a dormitory, no private rooms for us. If a soldier had difficulty getting around, we needed to help him. So I didn't mind because nursing was hard work. Some of those boys that we helped around were pretty good size and heavy to help move. It was a trying job. After about a year at Ain El Turk, our unit went by ship to Naples, Italy. We joined a large general hospital in Caserta. In Italy, we moved around some, depending upon the war effort. Can you imagine? One of our hospitals was set up on Mussolini's fairgrounds. Wouldn't he love that? By June of 1944, I was stationed at a hospital near Rome. In Italy, some of us were fortunate to get leave and tour the beautiful countryside. We saw so many grand things. I was even able to purchase a couple dolls to bring to my little niece, Janet, in Minnesota. I think she'll like them, don't you?
No.
While we were in Italy in March of 1944, Mount Vesuvius erupted. What a sight! We were not close enough to be in danger, but I had never seen anything like that in Minnesota. On November 19th of 1944, we were shipped to the port city of Leghorn, and we established a hospital on the coast. The next 3 months were especially active, many soldiers being cared for. By July of 1945, as the war was winding down, the hospital discharged the last of its patients. Our hospital unit over the war had treated 29,799 soldiers during our 25 months of deployment. I had served over 2 years as an Army nurse in the European Theater of Operations, 25 long months. While there, I was awarded the European Campaign Ribbon with 2 battle scars. I had served as a lieutenant in the United States Army, but was so anxious to get back to the United States. I had been on duty such a long time. Our ship docked at Miami Beach, and we were processed to the Army Ground and Service Forces stationed there. And then it was back to Minnesota. After my return to Leroy, I spoke to several community groups telling them of my work during the war. Also, though, when I got home, I helped care for my mother who was battling cancer. And sadly, she passed away on Thanksgiving Day of 1945, not too long after my return. My first civilian job was a public health nurse in Winona. Then I eventually joined the staff at Fort Snelling Hospital in St. Paul, again caring for veterans, and completed my nursing career there. I don't know if the Army created my love of travel, but over the years I had some great trips. I visited many countries in Europe, as well as other areas of the United States. I always had my camera with me and I took many pictures. It was always fun to share these pictures with my family. Many of them were made into slides, and on my trip to Leroy, I'd share my trip with everyone with my slideshow. One of my favorite trips was to Switzerland. I found the church where my father was baptized, and then he later came when he was 12 years old to the United States, part of a large family. They settled first in Wisconsin, and then some moved to this area. Some weekends I spent in Rochester with my sister Marcella, her husband Ernie Bowe, and son Brian. Other weekends I headed to Leroy to visit my brother Frederick, his wife Gertrude, and their children Richard, Roger, and Patty. Also in the Leroy area, I often stayed with my sister Eleanor, her husband Don Jones, and daughters Janet, Joanne, Nancy, and Donna. I know how busy farm life is, so when I came, I just pitched in and helped with whatever needed to be done. Washing dishes and cleaning were my specialty. I loved knitting. I made sweaters for some of the family. I know how difficult it was to go to special events living in a small town. So when I went to a play or a concert in the cities, I made sure to bring the program and share it with them. I have so many, many good memories. What a great life I had. As I never married or had children of my own, I felt especially close to my nieces and nephews. I guess my military service made me realize the value of helping others. I joined the AAUW, the St. Paul Women's Club, the Kaler School of Nursing Alumni Association, the Retired Military Officers Association, and I also worked in my church, the Edgecombe Presbyterian Church of St. Paul. But my most fulfilling times were spent with my brother and sisters and nieces and nephews on the farms near Leroy. I am so proud of my service to my country. Being an Army nurse was one way I could help ensure the rights and the freedoms that we all take so for granted. I hope in some way I was able to enrich others' lives. Even though I traveled around the world, I served my country overseas, lived in the city of St. Paul, I have always felt that Leroy was my home. Thank you for letting me share my story with you today.
And next we have a married couple, John Sr. and Marion Grass, and they will be presented by John Grass Jr. and his wife Sharon. The couple moved to Leroy about 1940.
Hi, my name is John Grass Sr. I was born in Amboy, Minnesota, April 3rd, 1915. My parents were Nelson Zora Grass, and I had two brothers. My dad came to the United States from Denmark when he was 10 years old. My mother was 3 years old when her mom died. She had two sisters that were adopted by three different families. Now, some people have asked us about this McLean, the middle name of my dad and myself. Well, people were wondering about that, and this was a neighbor of my folks when they were first married, my grandpa and grandma out at Amboy, and always kind of helped them when they were first married, so that's why they named my dad, middle name was McLean, and we have a grandson and a great-grandson that has that name now.
My name is Marion Louise Mollenhauer Grass. I was born September 15th, 1918 in Steele County. My parents were Louis and Martha Mollenhauer. They were both full-blooded Germans. I had one sister and three brothers.
My family moved from Amboy to Otana when I was 2 years old. My two brothers and I walked to and from country school both ways up the hill. And I graduated in 1933 from Otana High School.
I also lived in Owatonna with my family and attended school there. John and I were both active in the Rural Youth Organization, which was for youth too old for 4-H.
When I was a teenager, my dad would sometimes check the mileage on the car before he would let me use it. If I put on too many miles for the afternoon or evening, I would back the car all the way home, and this would turn the miles back on the odometer. Believe it or not, it worked those days. One evening, after a rural youth meeting, 2 young ladies needed a ride home. I decided whichever girl got in the car first, I would take her home last and ask her for a date.
Guess who was the lucky one? A courtship began, and we decided we were meant for each other. We were married March 27, 1940, at Trinity Lutheran Church in Owatonna.
In April of 1940, Mary and I, along with my parents, moved to a farm west of Leroy. We paid $25 an acre for the farm, 240-acre farm. Compared to that to today's prices of $10,000 or more. That's a big change in 80 years.
The house was a real mess. They even had farm animals living in it. The house had 2 stairways going upstairs. The first time we looked at the place, we went up the front stairway and calves went running down the back stairway. After a lot of elbow grease, we made living quarters for John's family upstairs, and John and I lived downstairs.
Lost my place.
Next page.
Okay. We had a four-door Ford car that both families shared. We had Holstein milk cows, hogs, horses, and chickens on the farm. We had no electricity till 1942 and no running water until 1951. Life was hard back then, but that was just how it was.
We kept food items cool in the milk tank next to the milk and cream cans. I carried water from the well by the milk house, which was more than 100 yards uphill. Boy, did I get my exercise. I carried 2 10-gallon milk cans of water, one in each hand, for laundry, cooking, and bathing. We took baths in a galvanized tub out on the south porch in the summer and in the kitchen in the winter. We heated water on the stove, and laundry was hung on a clothesline outside in the summer and in the basement and the kitchen in the winter.
We built the chicken house in 1941. Marion had 300 hens, some pullets, and roosters to butcher. She bought groceries and clothes with the egg money.
Our first son, John McLean Jr., was born August 31st, 1941 in Owatonna. I stayed with my parents in Owatonna during the last weeks of my pregnancy so I'd be close to the hospital when the time came. When we knew the baby was coming, we called John. He said he'd come as soon as he could, but he had to take a cow to the Owatonna vet on the way. Men just don't realize what women go through to have babies. Our second son, Richard Edward, was born December 29th, 1943.
We were so proud, both of our boys. They loved the livestock just like my dad and I did. Dick liked the dairy, Johnny liked the pigs. Both boys were in 4-H and FFA. They received many ribbons and awards for 4-H and FFA and open class at county and state fairs. Marion and I enjoyed being 4-H leaders during those years.
As you all know, farmers have a deep respect for Mother Nature. She gave us a big surprise on May 5th, 1965, just a week after Dick left to join the Army. A tornado went through our neighborhood, taking our barn and damaging a few of the outbuildings. We thank the good Lord that no one was hurt.
We built the new barn and repaired the other buildings. We had a lot of, sorry, I gotta change my hats. I enjoyed playing baseball and softball. We also enjoyed fishing and hunting. We hunted pheasants, fox, and deer around Leroy and made many trips to northern Minnesota to Echo Lake near Orr for deer hunting and fishing. All of our hunting group wore matching red felt hats, and we called ourselves the Red Hat Gang. Many families still go to Echo Lake to fish and hunt. We're going tomorrow, and much of our family are up there now.
John's father, Nels, instilled in him the valuable lesson of giving back to a place you call home. John joined many service boards that connected him with people and ideas that positively impacted the community in southern Minnesota. John also enjoyed planting evergreen trees and apple trees to enhance the landscape.
Some of the boards I served on included the Mower County Holstein Board, Mower County FHA Board, Leroy Co-op Creamery, Land O'Lakes Policy Committee, Leroy Township Board, the Leroy Adult Ag Advisory Board, Freeborn Mower Electric Cooperative Board, the Lake Louise State Park Board, Mower County Extension Committee, and Leroy Manor. No wonder Dick and I were so busy.
John was inducted into the Mower County Livestock Hall of Fame. His picture, along with many others, including both of his sons, hangs in the Crane Pavilion at the Mower County Fair.
Marion was always so proud of her, and proud in particular of her big garden and lawn. She enjoyed sharing the bounty of her garden with friends and neighbors and people in need. In later years, she made frozen jam to give away. When she died, she had so much jam in her freezer that everyone who attended her funeral got a jar of jam to take home.
I was especially proud of my large lawn. I spent many hours mowing, picking up sticks, and digging out dandelions with a pointed trowel. I sure didn't appreciate it when the boys would drive in the yard with a tractor and disc and get too close to my lawn.
You better believe it. We heard about it too. When Ray Jacobson would come to shell the corn, she was out there raking corn leaves before he even left.
Through the years, we always tried to encourage young people that needed help. In the early 1950s, Mrs. Sorensen across the road passed away. Her young daughter, Loris, spent a lot of time at our house. When she graduated from high school in 1955, we hosted her party. She later married Jim Nauman, also from Leroy. In 1958, we hosted a IFE student from Australia, and he's come back twice to visit us. A nephew, Bill Knight, also spent his senior year with us in 1970. His teachers in Florida were on strike, and he wanted to graduate on time.
We were blessed when two nice daughter-in-laws joined the family. One, June 24th, 1967, our oldest son, Johnny, married Sharon Lunning. Her husband passed away of leukemia, and she had 4 young sons. On September 10th, 1971, our youngest son, Dick, married Bonnie Nelson. Her first husband was killed in a car accident. She had 3 young sons. Eventually, 5 more Grass grandchildren were added.
In the early 80s, John's health took a nosedive when he started having trouble remembering things. We kept him at home for a number of years, but had to put him in the Ostrander nursing home in 1985. My parents were living there at the time. John passed away on February 19, 1987, of Alzheimer's and prostate cancer at the age of 71.
After my death, Marion moved to Leroy. She enjoyed being close to the grocery store, bank, and post office. Her sister also lived in Leroy, and she is now 98 years old.
In closing, I want to add that throughout my life, my faith was very important to me. My favorite Bible verse was Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, to them who are called according to his purpose. I shared my faith with many people over the years. I died of cancer at my home October 20th, 2012, at the age of 94.
Thanks for coming today and listening to our story of life on the farm. remember that in the end, it's not the years in your life that count.
It's the life in your years. Have a nice day.
Our last former citizen is Mr. Richard Harvey. He came to Leroy in 1953 with his wife, Olive, and they never left. They made Leroy their forever home. And here he comes now. I see him.
Apparently, I'm no longer a size 38. Good afternoon and happy Memorial Day. My name is Richard Vance Harvey, but everyone called me Dick. I wore this coat and hat when I returned after serving in World War II. The town of Leroy became an important part of my life. I was not born here, but it was my home for 30 years. I was born March 1st, 1923 in Hawkins, Wisconsin, to Victor and Elizabeth Harvey. When I was young, my family moved to Cable, Wisconsin, a small town about the size of Leroy in northern Wisconsin. We were in the Bayfield area, which is filled with lakes and forests. I grew up in a big family with 3 brothers, Warren, Marvin, and Victor Jr., and 2 sisters, Lucille and Marjorie. My father was a lumberjack and shipbuilder, and there were stretches of time when he was not home. So as the oldest son, I often hunted the wild game in the nearby woods for fresh meat for our dinner table. It was a responsibility I enjoyed. I graduated from Cable High School, and my parents gave me a black leather suitcase. It was a gift I wanted. I began attending the University of Wisconsin River Falls, studying agronomy. But World War II interrupted my plans. I was drafted into the Army in February of 1943 and served as a tech specialist in the 3062nd Quartermaster Bakery. I operated and maintained the diesel engines and generators that powered the baking equipment and ovens. I also assisted the bakers with the task of turning out 25,000 pounds of bread a day. One incident I will never forget occurred in December of 1944. We were stationed in the village of Bastogne, and I remember it as a peaceful place with jovial inhabitants and shops filled with souvenirs. On December 16th, the German army broke through the Allied lines, and thus began what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of the Ardennes. On December 18th, under German tank fire, our unit hastily packed up and moved out of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division moved in shortly after, and the following day, Bastogne was cut off by the Germans. We lost 2 members of our unit in that battle. After the war was over, I had the opportunity to visit the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's retreat near Berchtesgaden. I brought home a stone from the fireplace, but I did not incorporate it into the fireplace at our home in Leroy. Some people thought I did. For service in my country, I was awarded the Victory Medal, the American Theater Ribbon, the European, African, Middle Eastern Theater Ribbon with 4 bronze battle stars, 3 overseas service bars, and the Good Conduct Medal. There's a bolt-bound, yes, bolt-bound collection of manuals that I used during my training, if you want to take a look at that. Oh, one other thing. The knife. I made this knife from a broken bayonet and a piece of landing gear from a downed German fighter. Being a soldier in wartime comprises times of great terror and times of great boredom. Crafting the knife helped me deal with some portions of the boredom. My father, Victor Harvey Sr., is also an Army veteran, having served in World War I. He was one of the lucky ones who survived the Battle of the Argonne Forest. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, also called the Battle of the Argonne Forest, was the final offensive in World War I. It was the biggest operation in victory of the American Expeditionary Force in the entire war. The offensive took place in the Verdun sector, immediately northeast of the town of Verdun, between September 26th and November 11th, 1918. This led to the general advance along most of the Western Front, resulting in the German Army's final defeat in the signing of an armistice on November 11th, which is now known as Veterans Day, and it brought hostilities between the Allies and the Central Powers to an end. After my discharge from the military on December 30th, 1945, I knew more schooling was on my agenda. I moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and attended the St. Paul Bible Institute, now known as Crown College. It was here I met the love of my life, Olive Peterson. I graduated with a degree in theology in 1949, and Olive and I were married on June 15th, 1951, in the chapel of the college. Our family of two soon started growing. Dennis was born in 52, Sharon in 55, and Rodney in 1958. Olive was incredibly supportive when I told her I wanted to be a teacher. I then attended Augsburg College, where I received a Bachelor of Arts degree in education in 1952. We moved to Leroy in 1953 after I landed my first job teaching social studies. I continued to take some night courses and summer classes to complete my master's degree of arts in educational psychology in 1960. It was a long commute to the cities, but worth it when I became one of the first certified school counselors in the state of Minnesota. I served both Leroy Ostrander High School and Grand Meadow High School for a number of years through a cooperative program as a counselor in both schools. I always tried to set a good example for my children and for all my students. Through the years, I took on additional volunteer activities. I was the treasurer of the Southeastern Minnesota School Counselors Association for 14 years. I did my civic duty serving as a deputy selective service registrar for board number 74 in Moore County. I also served on the Moore County Mental Health Board, the Austin Community College Advisory Committee, and was a Minnesota Department of Natural Resources firearms safety instructor. My faith was always an important part of my life. Upon our arrival in Leroy, we began attending the First Baptist Church. I was soon teaching adult Sunday school classes and serving as a lay preacher, not only at the First Baptist Church, but at other Protestant churches as well. All three of my children were baptized in this church. The 50s and 60s brought many changes. The Leroy Public School was completely renovated when we came in 1953. There was a new ag shop, new classrooms, a band room, and a new auditorium gymnasium when I started teaching here. Several new churches were constructed and other churches built additions, including the Lutheran and St. Patrick's Church in 1955, the Presbyterian Church in 1959. In 1957, the old wooden dam at Wildwood Park was replaced, and the main street of Leroy was paved, replacing the old wooden sidewalk. In the 60s, the Bethany Bible Church was built, and the Baptist Church renovated the entire lower level. Wildwood Park became Lake Louise State Park. The Leroy Theater was turned into a bowling alley, and a new high school athletic field was made ready for sporting events. A fire at the Leroy Library damaged the building, and some renovations were necessary at that time. I also played a part in recovering a portion of Leroy's history. In 1896, Leroy purchased its first piece of firefighting equipment, as you've already heard, a hose cart, which was used to fight fires till its retirement in 1933. I spotted the hose cart in the field west of South Park in 1961 and purchased it from the city for $5. I wanted to make a barbecue with it, and my wife wanted to make a flower planter out of it. So I did both. We spent many years entertaining with it and enjoying the beautiful flowers. After our house in Leroy was sold, the hose cart was placed in outdoor storage and fell into great disrepair. My youngest son, Rodney, pulled it once again from the weeds in 2021 and has performed a museum-quality restoration on it. Additional information on the hose cart is on the table and back. It is my hope this portion of Leroy's history will be put on display here in its hometown. I went to meet Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, in 1983 at the early age of 60. I'm told the funeral was held in the school gymnasium to make sure there was room for everyone who wished to participate. I would have liked to see that, but I suspect I would have felt rather embarrassed. Thinking about my life here in Leroy and sharing portions of my story has been a pleasure for me. Note that I decided to wear one of my favorite red ties for this special occasion. It took my son some time to figure out how to tie it. Thank you for coming and listening to my story. I hope you enjoy the rest of this wonderful Memorial Day.